how watching movies can make you a better writer. A little information about myself. I'm a writer and a storyteller and a filmmaker. I most recently, as far as novels go, I wrote the BattleTech novel, Honor's Gauntlet, in that universe. And as a filmmaker, I've won some awards with short films recently, but before that, I did a lot of documentary film and narrative features, including a lot of stuff that was produced here locally that you might recognize. Currently, I'm involved with the League of Utah Writers. I'm the president-elect of the organization and the president of the Salt City Genre Writers chapter of the organization. And I really love telling stories, and I love helping people understand how to tell stories better. And that's what we're going to be learning in this class today, is really taking your time watching movies to learn how to be a better storyteller. There's a lot of techniques in movies that you can use for this sort of stuff. And really what we're going to look at is are techniques that you'll be able to use if you're interested in screenwriting or novel writing or whatever, but mainly how to take your knowledge of prose writing and understand how to take your interest in movie watching and fuel that more. So let's start, shall we? I'll share my screen here. And what we're looking at, like I said, we talked about the introduction, but the first thing I really want to talk to you about is pure cinema. Now, what is pure cinema? Alfred Hitchcock really talked about pure cinema a lot. And the idea is that it's really the juxtaposition of images to tell a story. Now, what that means is that cinema is a purely visual art form. Yes, it has dialogue. Yes, it has, it has people saying things and the story moves along that way. But the most interesting and unique thing about cinema in its purest form, according to people like Alfred Hitchcock, is the idea that that it's those juxtapositions between shots that tell the story, right? So how can we take reactions and create different experiences based solely on how we present the point of view of a character or how we present that to the audience? Now, we're going to take an example from Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, right? And we've got this shot of Jimmy Stewart, and this is sort of in the vein of pure cinema, right? Where we have a setup where we see Jimmy Stewart looking at something. There's no dialogue or anything. And then we cut to what he sees. So he sees this fight going on. And now we have his reaction. There's been no dialogue, but we're told a story. We're told a story about, here's a character and they're looking at something. We're showing you what they're looking at, and then we're showing your reaction. Now, that can work in a lot of different ways. In film, it can work in many different ways, right? So how can we use the same reaction shots to tell a different story? So how would this change if we put a different shot in the middle? We have the same shot of him looking out his binoculars, and then we put a different image here in the center. So let's do that again. So we see him. We put a different image here in the center. He's looking at something else. This woman, this single woman across the way, maybe he's a peeping Tom. Suddenly this look isn't necessarily one of suspicion, but it's maybe one of, maybe it's gross. Maybe it's a gross sort of look. And so you can see how in cinema you can take the same shots and reorganize them in different ways and tell different moments of story. One of my favorite uses of this in film actually recently would be in Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, where they have some of the most masterful storytelling in that movie. Well, probably, I don't know if you can see it from my background, but there's a lot of Star Wars here. I write for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider and a whole bunch of other outlets about Star Wars, so Star Wars is sort of part of my frame of reference. But cutting on the juxtaposition of things in as a way to tell the story and to create an idea works really well in The Last Jedi, better than any of the other movies in the sequel trilogy. In particular, there's the moment where In particular, there's the moment where Finn, in his naked leaking bag, asks Poe, "Where's Rey?" And it cuts instantly to Octu. And we understand that his question is being answered with the sequence ahead of us, and it's told in pure juxtaposition of the two shots. And that sequence leads all the way down this chain of title, this path, to Luke asking a question about where's Han. Now, we know where Han is, and there's this idea of a cinematic ellipsis where we don't need to get the rest of the information because we know what will follow after. But when Luke poses that question, where's Han? And the image cuts directly to Kylo Ren, to Ben Solo. We know something now. This is something that's telling us where's Han. There's this spiritual successor in Han. This is the person who is tortured by what happened to Han, and it carries the film forward in these ways. There's so many of those really great juxtapositions where a character might raise a question, then it cuts immediately to an answer. And this is something that we can do in our prose. And that's something I'd like to talk about here is how do we use this pure cinema for prose? And there's a lot of different ways to do it. So one of the ways to gain this effect in our writing is to see information strictly from the point of view of a character, even if their understanding of that information is wrong, right? Like the entire crux of Rear Window is that Jimmy Stewart's character sees what he thinks is a man murdering his wife. He doesn't know if he's correct. Other people see very similar things as they're going through and doing this and looking at the same things he is, and they're decoding it differently. So in prose, we can use this to really focus in on what our narrator or our point of view character believes based on what they saw. And it's something to really keep in mind. How do we show something through just their eyes? The other thing is taking point of view breaks, right? We could look at something like The End of the Affair, which is both a Graham Greene novel or a movie, and see how it changes depending on whose point of view we have. The first third, we'll talk about it a little bit here, but I do other classes that get into more detail in The End of the Affair. But the short version is Act 1 of the book is from one character's perspective, a writer named Morris Bendrix, and he's been this jilted lover, and he feels like the woman of his dreams that he loved intently left him, and he's worried that she's sleeping with someone else, and there's this affair, and he doesn't understand what the problem is that caused her to leave him. All he knows is that this was during the bombing raids in London, and it's during the bombing raids in London, and he is there's an explosion. He blacks out. He wakes up. She looks terrified, and she leaves. And she never speaks to him again. That's the end of their affair. Through a series of possibly terrible choices, he ends up with a copy of her diary. And the entire second act of the book is him reading her diary and her version and her perspective of these events. And by switching the point of view character, and by showing us a different view of the same events through their eyes, we're able to, in our prose, really change the story. So in this case, Sarah, the young woman, she was there at the bombing, right? They were having their tryst, and the explosion happened, and he was unconscious. And she offered a prayer, which was unusual for her. Her and Bendrix were sort of devout atheists, and she prayed to this God she didn't believe in, that if Bendrix just woke up, if he lived, then she would never see him again, and that she would stop living in this sin because she was a married woman. And when he wakes up, she's so taken with this. She's so shocked. She doesn't know how to react, and she leaves. And the person that Bendrix thinks she's been seeing has actually been this priest who she's been sort of harassing into trying to help her understand what this new belief in God is. And she doesn't know how to cope with that. And that's a really interesting way to take that sort of idea of juxtaposition of narrative, juxtaposition of point of view, and bring it into your prose. Another one I want to talk about are intermissions. Now, this is the intermission for Lawrence of Arabia. And we can use intermissions in our chapter breaks or our part breaks or breaks between books in really, really interesting ways. That really helps. So for Lawrence of Arabia, for example, we have the first part of Lawrence of Arabia, the entire first half of the movie is told from Lawrence's perspective, right? It's told from Lawrence's perspective in a way that we're pretty sure he's the hero of the story. Although it starts with his death. It starts in a nonlinear fashion. It starts with his death. And at his funeral, people are sort of talking about how great of a person he was. But one person there is just like, he was a showman. He was in it for himself. He wasn't actually a hero. He was the greatest, fraud since Barnum and Bailey or something like that. And we're left to wonder why this person is saying this, why this person is thinking this way. We watch the entire first half of the movie and we see that Lawrence is a hero, and we're like, that guy was out of his gourd, right? Like there's no reason for him to have thought this. And as the intermission breaks, we actually have a point of view change, and it changes the stakes of the story. It changes the stakes of the story, and then it changes our point of view character. And now we're in the head or the point of view of the reporter who actually made those statements about Lawrence in the first place. And as the second half of the story unfolds, because we're in this other viewpoint, we're able to look at Lawrence more objectively, and we wonder if what he was doing was for his own glory, or if it was he grew into having this bloodlust, where at the beginning of the story, he has these lines like when he tells Sheriff Ali, like, no friend of mine is a murderer, but by the second half of the movie, he's willfully, gleefully ordering murder after murder after murder, or attacks on places and things like that. So it forces the audience to change their perspective. This is something that you can do in your books. The other thing it can do is really change the stakes. When you open your book, think about this. Think about this a lot. When you open your novel, you have this benefit of the doubt, this narrative mystery, right? That your audience will give you, where they'll say, like, I'm curious about this. What is this about? And they keep reading, and because they want answers. When you use an intermission, you sort of buy a second opening for your book, and that narrative intrigue again. Think back to Battlestar Galactica, right? Where there's that season that ends where the Pegasus arrives, and we're left wondering how this is going to change the status quo and the stakes of the situations. And when we see the break after the intermission between seasons, what we see is that it's a year later and all the characters are in different situations completely, and we're wondering how that works. It's the same thing between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, right? Attack of the Clones ends with the beginning of the Clone War, and Revenge of the Sith begins having skipped it all entirely, and we're wondering what the stakes of the war are. Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, the same thing, where it ends with Han in captivity, Luke barely trained, Vader trying to talk about his father, Vader trying to assert his fatherhood over Luke, and us wondering what's really truth and what's really not. And so it buys you this extra time in the narrative when you come back on the other side. You can do this with your chapters. You can do this with your part breaks. You can change your points of view. You can change the narrative completely. You can use it to advance time. And as you're watching movies and you see how they do this, when they switch these points of view, when they insert these breaks between the movies, whether that's serialized storytelling like Star Wars, or whether it's the serialized storytelling of a TV show, or whether it's an intermission in a classic movie like Lawrence of Arabia or Seven Samurai, or problematic though as it may be, Gone with the Wind, or whatever, these movies all change the stakes in between these parts, and it gives you ideas of how you could change the stakes and sort of give something new and exciting to your reader halfway through your book. And I'd really invite you to really look at that and try to see if you can incorporate that into your writing. The next thing I really want to talk about is Alfred Hitchcock's idea of suspense versus surprise, because I think this is a really important thing that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to as prose writers, and people like Hitchcock really made it work really well. So Hitchcock had this thing, I call it Hitchcock's bomb under the table theory. And he says that the knowledge of the audience and the point of view of the piece really explains how an audience is going to feel during the course of a piece. So in this example of suspense versus surprise, there's a distinct difference between the two, and I'll explain what I mean. So we're having a chat right here. I'm teaching this class, and it would be surprising if, as I'm teaching this class, there's a bomb under my table and it explodes. That would be surprising, and you'd be left reeling, wondering, like, what just happened? How does this work? What is he okay? Do I need to call the authorities? Wait, this is pre-recorded. Did he stage that? I'm not sure. It would be surprising, but it wouldn't be suspenseful. Now, imagine that before this class started, there's a bomb, or there's a note at the beginning that says there's a bomb under Bryan's table and it will explode at some point during the class. And Bryan's unaware of it, but you as the audience are aware of it. And so as we're going through this and you're watching me teach, you're wondering, is the bomb going to go off? How does the bomb go off? Is there something that's going to trigger it? And it creates the suspense in you because you have information that I don't. And you're able to stew in that information, in that suspense. So you need to understand that suspense is created in many ways by giving the reader information that the point of view characters don't have. Now, it's more difficult to do that when you're doing a first-person piece. In third person, it's a lot easier. You can find ways to insert that information. But think about that. Really think about that. And how you can create those differences and how you can wield both of those tools equally without sort of with intention. I think that's really the thing that you want to do, is that you need to purposely build the tension or surprise as excuse me, as is best going to work for your story. And I think Hitchcock's suspense versus surprise is really one of the best ways to do that. So watch movies that are thrillers, that are suspense thrillers, and try to decode what information they give you. Think about what information they give you beforehand, before you find something out, and try to figure out where they surprise you. Because in horror films, it's going to be a combination of the two. You're going to have your jump scares, which are a little bit harder to pull off in prose, but you're also going to have those suspense pieces where you know that the killer's out there. You know that something is going to happen, and you know something that the lead character doesn't. It's that moment where, Drew Barrymore's on the phone and you see the killer behind her, but she doesn't have that information. You, as the audience, do. So how can we manipulate our readers in similar ways in our prose? And that's something I really want you to think about. Think about how you can incorporate those to more purposefully and intentionally bring those into your writing. The difference between surprise and suspense. And you can use them both. Really, really, really to great effect in your stories, right? You can have that little bit of a chapter beforehand with with somebody actually planting the bomb or whatever the case may be. And deny your characters that information, but give it to the audience. One writer who does this really well in books is George R.R. Martin. If you read A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones books, what he does, this is what his entire book is predicated on, right? No single character has a full view of the entire story. He shows us a piece of information after piece of information after piece of information from so many different points of view. We're the only ones who have that 30,000 foot view of how things are going. We're the only ones who have that information. And it's something you need to bear in mind, that you can have those disparate points of view that add up to a whole story or suspense sequence in the minds of your audience in that way. And it's something you should really think about. Think about how you can do that. The next thing I want to talk to you about is good exposition and really telling the story with dialogue. Characters, as you watch movies, you're going to get a better ear for dialogue, but you're also going to notice that characters never say things like, as you know, Alex, this is the third time we've done this experiment. And when they do, you know that rings false. You understand that it rings false because you because you know how people talk. Characters are always talking to each other, not the audience. And that's one of the things that I think people miss in their dialogue. I think that's one of the best things. There's so many movies that do it right and do it really well for you to understand that the characters are talking to each other and not the audience. And that's the best way to go about it. The other thing is that you need to imply things that the audience can infer, because they're not talking to the audience. So characters, I mean, how often do you use the name of your best friend, right? Or how often do you actually hear your own name? It's grating almost, right? You almost don't see it all the time. You never see your name. You never hear it. Catalog that. Catalog how often you hear your name in the course of a day or in the course of a conversation. And think about how often you're putting the names of your characters in the conversations and the dialogue you're having. Think about all the other bits of information that characters just know that they don't have to go back and explain. Like that Alex, as you know, this is the third time we've done that experiment. Both those characters know they've done that experiment 3 times. That's something they get to skip. They don't have to talk like that. They can say, I hope it works this time, which implies more than it says, and the audience can infer it. Now, I want us to watch a scene now that does this really well, and I think this is one of the best scenes. This is one of the best scenes of this sort of dialogue. And this is Indiana Jones. This is Raiders of the Lost Ark, and this is the scene in Nepal where Marion and Indy first meet. And I want you to watch this and catalog all the information that you can infer that doesn't feel stated outright, and note that every line of dialogue that they have is spoken to each other, not to us. So we'll watch this.
Hello, Marion.
Indiana Jones. Always knew someday you'd come walking back through my door. I never doubted that. Something made it inevitable. So what are you doing here in Nepal?
I need one of the pieces your father collected.
I learned to hate you in the last 10 years.
I never meant to hurt you.
I was a child. I was in love. It was wrong and you knew it.
You knew what you were doing.
Now I do. This is my place. Get out. Mohan, Temigru, Buliano.
I did what I did. You don't have to be happy about it, but maybe we can help each other out now. I need one of the pieces your father collected. Bronze piece about this size with a hole in it off center with a crystal. You know the one I mean?
Yeah, I know it.
Where's Abner? Where's Abner?
Abner's dead.
Marion, I'm sorry.
Do you know what you did to me in my life?
I can only say I'm sorry so many times.
Well, say it again anyway.
Sorry.
Yeah, everybody's sorry. Abner was sorry for dragging me all over this earth looking for his little bits of junk. I'm sorry to still be stuck in this dive. Everybody's sorry for something.
It's a worthless bronze medallion, Marion. You're gonna give it to me?
Maybe. I don't know where it is.
Well, maybe you could find it. $3,000.
Well, that will get me back. But not at this time.
I can get you another 2 when we get to the States. It's important, Marion. Trust me. You know the piece I mean? You know where it is?
Come back tomorrow.
Why?
Because I said so, that's why. See you tomorrow, Indiana Jones.
So this scene tells us so much. It tells us so much, but it doesn't actually say anything. I think this is one of the great hallmarks of screenwriters like Lawrence Kasdan. Lawrence Kasdan does this a lot in his movies. You can watch it in Empire Strikes Back, in the conversations between Han and Leia, in Return of the Jedi, just sort of generally. The Force Awakens, he does this, but his non-Star Wars and Indiana Jones work too does it really well with Silverado and The Big Chill. He's really great at helping characters talk to each other and allow the audience to infer things. So from this scene, we can infer that Marion was way too young for Indy, and it doesn't cast Indy in the most flattering light. He's been a hero to us up to this point, and now we're sort of left to question him. And they don't come out and say like, hey, these two dated when they were kids, and you can see where the dialogue could be very boring trying to get that same backstory out. And this is a really good way to approach the dialogue. It brings the stakes of the status quo, the stakes of their shared history, and it collides them together. And it brings an energy to the scene. This is something that Robert McKee in his book Dialogue talks about, and maybe Story as well. He talks about scenes are really about 3 things. There's the text between the two characters that are they're talking, each has a perspective, and that's one thing and 2 things. But there's this 3rd thing that every scene is about. In this scene, Indy's intention is to get the headpiece of the Staff of Ra. Marion's intention is to get Indy out of the bar. But the 3rd thing is that unspoken relationship between them, the hurt that they had between them, that there's so much subtext in this that it works really, really well. And that's what you need to infuse your scenes with. It's stuff like this. Another movie I would suggest for you to check out for this sort of dialogue would be Casablanca, the Michael Curtiz film from the 40s with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. We're going to talk about Casablanca in a minute. But I want you to go back and look at that scene again. Watch that scene over and over and over again and see how much exposition is actually in it. Write down how much information you actually get out of that scene that maybe you're shocked by. Another scene to do that with is the first scene where the 2 government stooges arrive at the school to talk to Indy about what the Ark of the Covenant is. Now, it's a really smart scene in a lot of ways in that they allow characters who don't have knowledge of a thing talk to an expert who is knowledgeable about that thing, and they act as a stand-in for the audience. So they come in and say, like, what's he talking about, this Ark? And he's like, the Nazis have discovered Tanis. And they're like, what does that mean? We have no idea, because we as the audience don't know. We're not scholars in that way, in the way Indiana Jones is. And it allows Indy to tell the entire story about the Ark and what it represents and how it works to these people in a way that feels very natural, and it doesn't feel info dumpy. Guillermo del Toro did the very same thing by introducing the new agent in the first Hellboy film. So he becomes the point of view character to experience the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense for the first time, because he's new and doesn't know any of this stuff. And for everyone else there, it's commonplace. And so by bringing that fish out of water point of view into a scene, you can bring a new life to it and make the exposition particularly through the dialogue, feel so much more exciting and vibrant. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Casablanca. And part of this is how to build your exposition in a way that creates that narrative tension in the reader. And Casablanca does this beautifully. So for those of you who don't know, well, I'm going to say see Casablanca because it's terrific. It's amazing. It's just a great film. It's really well structured, and we could teach a class on storytelling just using Casablanca. But through the beginning of Casablanca, we get a bunch of exposition through the eyes of a number of characters about Rick, Humphrey Bogart's character. And we're told that he never drinks with people. He doesn't interact with the people in the saloon. He doesn't have friends. And he's not impressed by anything, and he stays out of politics. There's nothing that is at stake in the world that matters to him outside of the world of his saloon. And we understand that he's broken. We see him, and he seems like a very broken person. And then when Ilsa comes in, we don't know who she is. We don't know what her relationship to him is. But we know at first when she asks Sam to play as time goes by that there's something different about this. And he says, no. I forgot the words. And he's playing coy, and she insists. And when Rick shows up, it's the first time he's shown great emotion. I mean, earlier in the evening, he watched one of his friends, Senior Ugarte, played by Peter Lorre, get gunned down by the police and just told everybody, keep drinking, everything's okay. It was a minor disturbance. And he shows this intense emotion when he arrives, hearing as time goes by, and tells Sam, I thought I told you never to play that song. And then he sees Ilsa. And it goes back to that pure cinematic juxtaposition situation where you see him and his intense look on his face, and she sees him, and they meet eyes, and it comes back to him, and he's shattered all over again. His heart breaks all over again in front of us. And we're left wondering why. And then he sits down. The chief of police, who's been telling us stories about how Rick never has drinks with anybody, and it doesn't matter, and everything with Rick is how it is, says when Rick is invited to have a drink, the guy tries to reject for Rick's like, no, Rick never. And he says, no, thank you. I think I will. And we know something's different because he's breaking all of the rules that have been established for him. And it's Ilsa. There's something about Ilsa, and we don't understand it. We get through this thing, and he breaks all of them. He buys their booze. He drinks with them. He sits with them. He's emotionally affected in a way we've never seen him before. Why? And this is the question that we're asking ourselves. We've got just enough exposition to understand that this is a mystery we want solved. Then what happens? After Ilsa leaves, Rick gets drunk, and he demands that Sam play him as time goes by forward. You know what I want to hear. If she can stand it, I can. And we know there's some great gap that's been brooked between them. And then it cuts to a flashback of the two of them in love in Paris on the day the Nazis marched in. And we see that they were very much in love, and they had to get out of Paris. And as they're planning their escape, she discovers a terrible truth. He doesn't know what that truth is, but he gets to the railway station in the rain, and Sam arrives with the letter from her, and she says she can never see him again, and she can't tell him why. And she leaves him there on the platform. You can't tell if he's crying or not because the rain hides his tears, or what might be tears. He crumples the note up and leaves it, gets on the train, and that's the end of the flashback. And she comes in, and we discover that she's married, and we discover that she thought her husband was dead when she was involved with Rick, and she found out she was alive, and she loves her husband, and her husband is this war hero. And I want you to think, as you watch Casablanca, how the movie would have felt if they would have told it chronologically. What would have happened if they'd have taken that piece of Paris and moved it back to before the movie started. We know that they're in love, and we know that she leaves him because her husband is alive. It robs the rest of the story, the first act of the story, of all of its narrative tension. It takes away the interest in the mystery for the audience. Shows us the exposition exactly when we need to in order to understand the story continuing forward. It doesn't show us a minute too soon because they're smart enough in Casablanca to understand when that ruins the narrative tension for the audience. So I want you to think about that for your stories. Can you put off your exposition? Can you use your exposition and wield it? Wield it in a way that's going to help your audience enjoy the story more and provide revelations for them. Star Wars is the same way, right? Vader could have, forget the idea that George Lucas didn't know that Vader would be Luke's father, but in the stories, we understand it now. Vader could have told Luke at any time that he was his fan, that he was his, that he was his father. He could have told him at any point during Empire Strikes Back, but he waits until the most dramatic moment to tell him. And it forces us to go back and reevaluate everything we've seen. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And it leaves us to wonder, is he lying? Is he not? That's the same way secrets are really good for holding on to that, right? When characters keep secrets are essentially a piece of exposition about a character. Sometimes you can use those secrets as suspense or surprise. If the audience knows what secret a character is keeping and knows that the stakes of them revealing that secret are high, it can create tension. In the case of Vader, that secret comes as a surprise. That bit of exposition is surprising to us, but it affects everything else, and it causes this cascading effect for us to go back and reevaluate everything we'd seen before. Paris does the same thing. It forces us to reevaluate what we understand about Rick. It forces us to reevaluate the relationship of what we understand between Rick and Ilsa, but it also encourages us to ask more questions about how this is going to play out. So what I want you to do is really think about your exposition and think about how you can hold off as much of it as you can, as long as you can. Never give a piece of exposition to the audience that they don't need, and only give it to them exactly when they need it to understand everything else going forward. And the Paris flashback in Casablanca is, I think, the perfect example of that. Watch Casablanca, see how that works. Even if you hate the film, sit down, force yourself to watch it and understand the narrative mystery built and how it would be robbed by moving Paris back before the beginning of the movie. If you haven't seen Casablanca, I'm very sorry I've spoiled it for you, but the film is, 80 years old. So that's on you. I'm sorry. The next thing we're going to talk about is this idea of scene polarity, that scenes in movies, scenes really need to, hold on a second. Scenes need to switch in polarity. Robert McKee and a few other writers have really talked at length about this idea, but really great structure requires scenes to have switches in their stakes, decisions to be made, or pitfalls to be had, or obstacles to be overcome or fallen into in the course of every scene. You want to create a roller coaster effect of the way the polarity in your scenes works. So to that end, you want to take scenes that start on a positive polarity, on a positive charge, and make sure that they end on a negative charge. Because a choice, if a scene starts on a positive charge and ends on a positive charge, it didn't go anywhere. It didn't change the stakes of your story. It didn't matter. It can go from positive to a double positive. That changes the stakes and it builds something. It can go from a negative to a double negative, and most climaxes do that, where they'll build negative after negative after negative and keep changing the stakes to deepen them. So, but they create that roller coaster effect. And what I would suggest is if you're stuck somewhere in your story, sit down and outline the polarity of each scene, and scenes that have where they start and end on the same polarity. If you have more than one or two of those in a row, that's where the problem in your story is going to be. And you can do this with your novels. And you can do it with your stories. But as an example, just to help you understand it better, I'm going to go through and explain the polarity of Luke Skywalker's introduction in A New Hope. The scene polarity here starts on a neutral charge, right? Luke is at best ambivalent, at best excited, but at worst ambivalent about the fact that the Jawas have arrived and they've got new droids. And maybe they'll speak Bocce. He doesn't know. So it ends on this really neutral tone where it's just like, I don't know what's going on here. Luke actually kind of gets a little bit excited thinking that these droids might save him work and that he might be able to join the academy. I mean, this is sort of the internal monologue of the character that we don't see until later, but we're able to cross-reference it back. But the scene sort of ends on this negative where he's like, I was going to go to the Tashi station to pick up some power converters. And his uncle's like, you can waste your time later. These droids need to be cleaned. So Luke starts very free and ends sort of chained to these droids. And he doesn't like it and ends on this negative tone. The next scene with Luke has him sort of really throwing a temper tantrum, literally just playing with his toys. Like, it just isn't fair. Oh, Biggs is right. I'm never going to get out of here. And 3PO sort of has to coax him and say, like, well, what is there anything I can do to help? Like, what's going on? And eventually sort of 3PO's chatter about the rebellion starts to excite Luke, and the stakes of the scene change. And then once he starts cleaning R2 and finds Leia's hologram, he's excited. So we start on this negative where, like, man, I don't want to do my chores, to, my God, there's an adventure out there. I can go on this adventure. I can do this. And that's how these scenes work. So you see, we've started neutral, we went negative. This scene opened negative and went positive again. Now these scenes, they start with excitement. Luke comes down to sit down at dinner with his aunt and uncle, and he's like, I found this adventure, and he gets beaten down. His uncle's like, Obi-Wan's just, Ben Kenobi is just a wizard and a crazy old man. Your father, I told you to forget him. No, you can't go to the academy this year. You have to, like, next year, maybe. And Luke leaves depressed. We get the famous sequence of the binary sunset at this point, where Luke is just sort of forlorn and looking out to the horizon, thinking about what could be next for him because his status quo is terrible. So it goes from positive back to negative. And this keeps going, right? Luke goes in resigned to the garage and then finds that he's lost R2. Not only is R2 lost, the next scene says sand people have him. Then Luke is excited for the adventure to go get him, but then he gets his ass kicked by sand people. Then he's excited again by Obi-Wan showing up. And it just kind of keeps going on and on. That roller coaster keeps the audience interested. The climax works the same way. The trench run is something that just keeps building. It keeps taking things away from Luke. Think about that. Next time you watch A New Hope, think about how the stakes just keep getting worse. At first, it's like, okay, we can't use torpedoes. We have to use ray guns. We have to use lasers in these small one-man fighters, these snub fighters. We can't go up there with our capital ships. It wouldn't matter. It's designed to prevent that. They didn't think these would be a threat, so we can screen through their outer defense. So you're going to be there largely defenseless. Okay, so Luke gets there. He's a new pilot. The first bombing run, failure. They kill most of Gold Squadron. Red Squadron has to go in. Luke's superior officer, his leader, Red leader, actually makes the shot but misses, showing us how impossible that shot is, and then dies, telling Luke he's got to get set up to take the shot. So Luke gets into the trench to take the shot. First he loses Biggs, his best friend from home. That's emotional. That's awful, right? So we've gone from like negative to negative to negative, or further negative. This is the double negative, right? And then he loses Wedge. Wedge has to leave. It's a triple negative. Vader destroys R2. He can't use R2's help, who's been his most benevolent friend through the course of this journey. That's like a quadruple negative. Then he is told he needs to take away his targeting computer. It's another negative. Then Vader gets him in his sights. It's another negative. Now Han Solo shows up, brings the positive right back up, right? You see how the climax just sort of digs them further and further and further into that hole. And then the solution to that climax brings them back out, and it's joyous. I mean, I think there's very few scenes in cinema history that build that tension the way the Death Star trench run does in A New Hope. And like I said, so that's really what you're looking for. That's the gold you're digging for as you're looking to chart the polarity of your scenes, is to create that roller coaster. And sometimes you're going to have these steep drops like a roller coaster, and it's going to jump right back up. And sometimes it's going to do a loop-de-loop. Sometimes you're going to need to climb and do all that positive, so the fall is more drastic. You know, it's part of the adage. The harder you make them laugh, the harder they cry. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. So this is a really great way to help you diagnose problems in your story. Like I said, if you're having a problem with your story and it seems stagnant, chart your scenes on this polarity scale. Is it a positive for my point of view character? Or is it a negative for my point of view character? And when you figure that out and you look at it on the page, you're going to see something very distinct about how it works. And you're going to see where there's problems that you hadn't anticipated. And those are scenes that you can go in and tweak. So that's absolutely something that you can watch that in tons of movies, whether that's Die Hard or The Fugitive or Casablanca does the same thing. Like, really great movies just do that. It's just a really great way to look at your structure. The next thing I want to talk to you about, as we're sort of rushing through this, is genre explorations and inspiration. Genre tropes are really helpful to understand how a genre works. So binging movies of the genre that you're working in can give you ideas of what to avoid, but also a tangible sense of visuals that you might want to include, but also what the well-worn tropes are in the genre that you're working in that you want to avoid. I would also say not just watching movies. Like, so we have on the screen, we've got romantic comedies with The Apartment, right? Or horror films, or sci-fi or fantasy. Binging a whole bunch of movies in the same genre that you're about to embark on writing on are going to help you understand better what to avoid and what your audience expects, right? A romantic comedy, no matter how offbeat it's going to be, is still going to need to end with that happily ever after. A fantasy movie is going to have certain tropes that are going to need to be paid attention to. Same with sci-fi, same with horror. And going through and binging these genres are going to really help you understand what those things are. The other thing I would recommend is going to tvtropes.com and looking up the tropes there. Looking up what tropes are in these movies, really deconstruct those tropes, see how you can make them fresh. The other thing I would say is go there or just Google harmful tropes and understand why some of the tropes that we really rely on in storytelling could be harmful to people, right? Like colonialism or white savior tropes or bury your gays. This is a really harmful trope where people will be like, hey, look, I'm bringing in this diversity, and then the gay character is the one that's killed, right? Or the LGBTQ character, or however that works. And it's not that you can't kill LGBTQ characters, but if they're the only one and they're in there as a token, that's problematic in the first place. And you can watch, if you look up these harmful tropes, you'll get lists of movies that fall into these harmful tropes. And you can watch these movies and see how they did it in order to find out how you can avoid it in your stories. It makes you more creative in being able to problem solve through these things and give you a better, more diverse, wide-ranging story that's going to be attractive to more people and not accidentally cause a problem, right? Like, we don't need more white savior movies. We don't need more movies with tropes like that, right? they're problematic. And you need to go out and do the research to understand why they're problematic, and it'll change the way you view movies, right? You can say like, oh, like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, I love that movie, but it's problematic and it has this streak of white savior, right? Like Indiana Jones is the white guy and he's going to come in and solve the problem of the Indians there and find their Shankara stones. And it has a lot of problematic stereotypes about things, partially because it was predicated on a movie that was, in fact, racist, right? I love Gunga Din. Gunga Din is a great film. One of my favorite screenwriters ever. William Goldman hailed it as his favorite movie ever. But it's racist. I mean, it's centers a white guy in grease paint playing an Indian. It's a fantastic film, but it has problematic elements. And Indiana Jones is sort of predicated on some of those problematic elements, especially the way the thuggee, the cult works. So being aware of this stuff is going to help you avoid those pitfalls in your own stories and help you build a better story that's not going to hurt any marginalized population. Unless that's your intention, in which case I've probably lost you anyway and it doesn't matter. The next thing I want to talk about is the structure of mashups. Mashups are really great and they can help us understand the requirements of different genres and then help us really create something new when it gets mashed up. This on the screen is a film called Shaun of the Dead. And the billing on the poster was it's a romantic comedy with zombies. And that's exactly what it is. It perfectly hits every expected genre beat of a romantic comedy, and it hits every expected genre beat of a zombie film, and it blends the two of them together. And when you're looking to figure out how to blend two genres together, understanding how they're built and understanding where they can interconnect can do that. So I would say study Edgar Wright specifically, right? Edgar Wright did the Cornetto trilogy, I think is very specifically what you need to check out, which is Shaun of the Dead, which is a mashup between romantic comedies and zombies. Hot Fuzz, which is an 80s buddy cop movie crossed with The Wicker Man and those sort of 70s British horror films. And At World's End, which is a mashup of the buddy reconnection road comedy with an apocalyptic end of the world story. And it's stunning how the screenplays are so careful that they actually take the beats of all of the genres and pay them off perfectly. So I guarantee that if you watch those three movies and catalog each of those genres simultaneously, the two genres together, as you're watching the film, you're really going to have your mind blown about how you can mix stories. And it's going to give you ideas about how you can mix genres that seem unlikely. A book I'm working on is a mashup of gothic horror and science fiction. And trying to figure out how those two meet has been such an education in genre, in structure. And I think I've done successfully. But it was really exciting to think about what possibility those two things could bring. The next thing I want you to think about is watching and reading good adaptations of movies. So on the screen here, we have Stephen King's Misery that was adapted by William Goldman and then made into a movie by Rob Reiner. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, though I will say that I don't know, maybe I should take that slide down given J.K. Rowling's turn into transphobia. But The Prisoner of Azkaban, directed by Alfonso Cuarón and sort of adapted by him, is the best of the Harry Potter adaptations. The Godfather by Mario Puzo and then Francis Ford Coppola, William Goldman adapting his own book for The Princess Bride. Read the book and then watch the movie and then see how things get changed between them and why, because film is a different media than books. And as someone who tells stories in both media, I really love and am excited by a really good adaptation to see how they change things and why, for what considerations. Because sometimes things just play differently. Sometimes things play differently in ways you wouldn't expect. And Sometimes there's things that work really well in a book that wouldn't in a movie, and vice versa. And by going through and really doing a thoughtful examination of the book, then the movie, and then coming back and dissecting why they changed what they changed, why the mediums differ or why the media differs, and how they did it, is going to give you a really great understanding, so that when you're watching a movie, you can imagine what the novelized version would feel like. And that activating those parts of the brain are going to give you as a writer a really great springboard into understanding how to watch movies in a way that's going to help you understand how to write books better. And I truly believe that. So read Stephen King's Misery, watch the movie. Read The Godfather and watch the movie. Read Princess Bride and watch the movie, and understand what all those differences are and how they went through there. Like, people forget that Stephen King wrote half a romance novel in the Misery novel. William Goldman very smartly excised that from the adaptation. Why? Trying to understand. I mean, and there's books that Goldman wrote about why he made those decisions, but it's going to make you a better writer to understand that and see how you can cross apply films into your novels and take the techniques and the things like that and bring them to life in your prose. So that's it for my presentation. Normally, if this was not during the pandemic, I would open up for questions, but you can get a hold of me via email or on my Twitter or on my website, and I'm happy to answer more questions. I do for Writer's Digest in their Script University, a 10-week version of this course that's very, very expanded. So there's definitely a lot more to cover. This is the very, very narrow view of it. But I hope you learned something, and I hope that I'm able to see you in the Q&A session, or if you have questions, you can do that, or you can hit me up at I'm weekly at the Salt City Genre Writers meetings, usually via Zoom, since we can't be in person at the moment. And you can find that at saltcitygenrewriters.com. So thank you very much. Thank you for watching this, and I hope you learned something, and I look forward to hearing from you and hearing about the great stories that you tell based on all of this stuff.